I would like to introduce you to Dr. Andreas Wion, who is the research ecologist with the U.S. Geological Survey, at the New Mexico Landscapes Field Station based in Santa Fe. And the field station is a 30-plus year partnership between Bandelier National Monument and the USGS. And their research uses tree rings to understand forest ecosystems in New Mexico and how they've been transformed by drought, insect outbreaks, and wildfires. Andreas received his PhD in ecology in 2022 from Colorado State University in Fort Collins. And that's where he met his wife, Gwen, who any of you who were here for the April meeting, you remember Gwen, who works for the Institute of Applied Ecology, and she's a specialist in seeds. He has previously worked for the U.S. Forest Service as a botanist and an archaeologist in Utah and South Dakota, and he's currently a forest ecologist studying the interactions between climate, wildfires, and forest dynamics. But New Mexico still remains his favorite place, and he's been happy to call it home since last July. So thank you for coming and enlightening us on Masting.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much, everybody. Can you hear me okay in the back? I'm just gonna project. Doing all right. Good. I forget what I originally called this talk, but this is going to be everything you wanted to know about the Pinyon but never thought to ask. So thank you, Mary, for that introduction. And kind of the fundamental question we're going to be looking at here is why there's so many Pinyon crops in some years and not in others. And the short answer is masting. We're going to spend the next hour talking about this. So we'll just wrap it up here. The answer is masting. Talk's done. But this refers to the interannual variability in seed production by a population of plants. And if you think about it, it might be some of the oldest ecological knowledge. When you were a hunter-gatherer 10,000 years ago, you either knew where to find seeds or you starved, right? So this knowledge of understanding plant seed cycles is probably pretty ancient. Pinyon in particular is probably the most important food source anywhere it's found. It's got about 3,000 calories per pound, these pine nuts do. So it's higher than steak. It's higher than most other nuts except cashews. It's higher than chocolate, but with none of the sat fats. It contains all 20 amino acids, and of the 9 that are essential for human growth, it's got higher concentrations than corn in 7 of those. So a diet of pinyon nuts, acorns, beans, and maize is almost all you need. Supplement it with some deer and some fish. But essentially, it was one of the most important food staples of New Mexico for a long period of time, partially because they store really easily and for long periods of time. And they're delicious, because of course they are. But let's go back in time for a second. So this is I'm working with this laser pointer here. This is a generalized elevation diagram showing what vegetation communities look like in the past versus the present. And we can see that generally plant communities have shifted up slope since the recession of the last ice age. So since about 10,000 years ago, as the glaciers were retreating, these huge ice sheets covering all of North America, plant communities were kind of following them as they retreated back to Canada. So in the past, we had spruce fir, these subalpine communities occupying a large zone that we might see things like white fir or Doug fir in today. Ponderosa pine and Pinyon are relatively recent newcomers to the scene. Pinyon in particular shows up around 8,000 years ago, which is pretty recent. If we're thinking about millions of years or even hundreds of thousands of years, 8,000 years is like yesterday. But it's been continuing this migration since then. It's, northern Colorado, northern Utah. It's basically a weed. People will just whack it out there because it grows so vigorously and so much they hate it. I'm like, don't kill the pinyon. We love it down here. But increasingly, New Mexico is becoming less suitable for pinyon with these hotter and hotter droughts we keep experiencing. So slightly more recent history. This is a photo from 2002 of the Pajarito Plateau. And all these red trees are not supposed to be red. Those are all pinyon. Yeah, and here is the post shot with all that gray. All the green you see are just junipers. So this was basically complete pinyon mortality in 2002. And a lot of this was because of the serious drought that was going on, but also a big insect outbreak, Piñon ips. It's a natural host of Pinyon. It always has attacked Pinyon trees. It was just a really bad year, and it got super hammered here in New Mexico. So it's important to understand how continued climate change is going to affect the Pinyon, and that's what we do at the New Mexico Landscapes Field Station. As Mary mentioned, we're a 30-year partnership between Bandelier National Monument and the USGS, and we basically provide the science to answer the management questions that either Bandelier has, or maybe the Forest Service, BLM, state, Native Plant Society, anyone who has a science question, we provide the answer to. So it's a really fun job. I get to do a lot of fun stuff. I guess I won't spend too much time on this, but yeah, I just got my PhD like a year ago, so I'm pretty fresh to this. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. I'm currently a postdoc, and I'm speaking today as a private individual and not as representative of the United States government. But my research is broadly forest ecology. I like to think about how trees regenerate following fires, following droughts, what the forests of the future might look like, and what we can do to maybe better manage forests for this uncertain future. So I work at Treeline, which is pretty exciting. Most people think of a mountain ecosystem like this. This is outside of Telluride. Nice aspen, spruce fir. But I actually work at lower Treeline, which is kind of the Pinyon juniper range, which is a different kind of treeline, but still beautiful in my opinion. Lower tree line is really important because it is that hot and dry margin of tree species ranges. So as the climate gets hotter, these trees are really living on the edge and will continue to live on the edge and may be a harbinger of what is to come. And so let's think about that for a second. What's in store for the future? There's a paper that came out, 2 years ago? Just last year. And this is showing the long-term tree ring record of droughts going back to the year 800. And the last 22 years have been the driest 22 years in the last 1,200 years. So it is extremely, extremely dry. And a big reason for this is just because it's hotter. So droughts have always happened. There's nothing amazing about this drought that's so different from past droughts, except that it's hotter. And I'm talking to a room full of plant people. So this is going to be really intuitive compared to my freshman lecture class. But if it's really humid and it's hot, that's not going to suck a lot of water out of plants. Think of a rainforest. You have huge leaves, big lush forests. It's because it's humid and they're not really stressed. But if it's 80 degrees and 100% humidity, that's different than 80 degrees and 0% humidity. That is pulling water out of plants. And so as it gets hotter and hotter and hotter, these droughts are harder and harder and harder for plants to keep transpiring and to keep surviving. And this is what we see over time. We're all familiar with exponential curves. That's when things double over time. So these are mortality rates, background mortality rates of a lot of major tree species, fir, hemlock, pine. And we see that they're increasing pretty rapidly over time. And this is largely because of these really hot droughts. And so I think this is a really interesting question of when, a forest dies, what replaces it? As this climate is changing, it's probably not going to be the same thing that was there 100 years ago. They're going to be species that are better adapted to these hotter, drier climates, maybe more frequent disturbances, and they'll be fundamentally different ecosystems than they were in the past. And so this has been a lot of background to kind of the general problem here, but I'm very interested in the role of seeds in post-fire landscapes. So how trees are regenerating after these big fire events like we're all very familiar with. So kind of going to break it down. We're going to talk about what is masting and why it happens, how it impacts forest ecosystems, including animals and people, and then how forecasting masting might improve forest management. So as I kind of mentioned earlier, masting is this variable and synchronous production by a population of plants, and it kind of sets the rhythm and the tempo of the forest. I'm a musician, right? So masting is kind of the drum beats that keeps the beat going in the forest, and I think you'll agree with me by the end of this talk. So masting is actually an Old English word. It goes back to the 10th century, the Byzantine Codex. It was referenced by Chaucer in the 13th century and then Shakespeare in the 16th century. So even though this is a word many people probably have never heard of, it's a very old word. And it refers basically to like an abundance of acorns. It's tied to the practice of pannage, where peasants would pay the landed elite to go turn their pigs loose in the forest, and they'd fatten them up and slaughter them in the winter. So masting is this practice of sending your pigs out into the forest to eat all the acorns. But what does this look like in practice? So these are a couple of sites I have. Each line here is a tree, and on the horizontal axis is time. On the vertical axis is cone production. And we can see at this top site, it's very variable, right? These guys are producing cones almost every year. Something's going on. It's really variable, and it's not very synchronous, as opposed to this site, where almost everything is producing cones all at the same time. And then there's these years where there's nothing in between. And of course, it's a spectrum. So here's a different example where they're pretty synchronous, but it looks like they're producing a lot more frequently than this site here. So this is just a way of visualizing this data, right? Trees are always producing seeds, and this is something that happens at the tree level. But when you combine these to a population level, we start to get these patterns. And so masting has always been really poorly studied because it just takes so long to study it, right? If you're going to go out and observe a tree every single year, it's going to take however many years it takes to observe however many years of seed crops. But I today stand on the shoulders of giants because people have been doing this work for 100 years, and now I can rely on all of their data to ask very interesting questions. So we're going to be talking about some new research, but fundamentally, why does this happen, right? So if evolution is the how things happen, ecology is the why it happens. I've always liked that kind of framework. So what's really interesting about masting is what would select for a plant to not produce as much seed as it can every single year? Why would a plant say, you know what, I'm not going to do it this year. I'm going to hold off. You know, it's interesting. There's clearly some sort of fitness benefit that comes from not reproducing. And that's one of the great mysteries here. So there are many hypotheses as to why trees mast, and I'll be relying on my favorite authoritative news source, The Onion, to go through these. And so the first idea is that trees just don't have the resources necessary to produce crops every year, right? So this is almost the null hypothesis, is that, well, I just didn't have enough water, so I didn't do it this year. You know, that's kind of the baseline thought, is that they're resource limited. Another thought is this idea called predator satiation. And this is this idea where if you're variable, if you have these years where you have no seeds at all, the forest starves. All of the mice, all of the birds that eat your seeds, their populations crash. But then when you put out a whole bunch of seeds and there's no mice, your seeds are more likely going to survive, right? So there's this fitness advantage to starving and to satiating predators. I think it's a really interesting idea. I think it's kind of hard to prove. But then there's all sorts of different ideas, right? There's so many possible explanations to explain this that it gets kind of confusing, and I'm not going to bore you with all of them. We'll talk about these two broad ideas today. But how does this happen? Let's kind of walk through the basics of how cones are produced. Trees, not all trees, but piñon trees in particular, they have male branches and female branches. And so male branches produce pollen, and female branches produce cones or flowers, pine flowers, right? Seeds. But they'll never the same branch, right? It's a one branch will either be doing one or the other. And of course, pollen has to fertilize a pine flower, a cone, to create a seed, right? So we can think about, these interesting ideas of mammals driving patterns of seed production, but fundamentally, you need pollen to get to the pine flower in order to make a seed. So let's break this down a little bit further. So this is a $10 science word, reproductive primordia initiation. So this is a decision, in quotes, where the tree is growing, its branches are growing, and then at the end of the year it says, I'm either going to keep growing or I'm going to start making sex cells. That is the reproductive primordia initiation. And this figure here, this is time. Year 0 will be the year that you see green cones, the year that we're out collecting pinyon. So we're going back 1 year, 2 years. It is the late summer. I took these from my dissertation, so I still don't remember the animations. Cone initiation happens about 2 years prior to cones being ripe and mature. Then they are pollinated the following year. So this is the next spring. So let's think about this. Last September, cones were being initiated. This June, they are being pollinated, and they will be fertilized next year and mature next year. So it's a 3-year cycle. It's 2 and some change. Call it 3 years. But it's a long time period, and there's these discrete events that can really importantly affect the total amount of seeds at the end of this. I'm not sure what I'm looking at. So ultimately, what determines how many cones any tree might produce? My research shows that it's largely tree size, and I think this is tied to light availability. So for example, if you can imagine you're walking through a forest and it's really dense and all the trees are super skinny and there's no lights and the canopies are really narrow, those trees clearly don't produce a ton of cones because they're so small. But it's these big open-grown trees here that wind up producing tons of cones in lots of years, more frequently than other trees. So I believe it's this, the amount of light ultimately controls the proportion of female branches on a tree. And so this is a big question. How is climate change going to affect masting? This is a paper from my advisor that she wrote when she was in her PhD, showing that there have been declines in Piñon Pine cone production. So what she did is she measured some sites from the 1970s and compared them to today and found strong declines in cone production compared to the 70s that were concurrent with the change in growing season temperature. So if it got warmer, it produced fewer cones. And so why do we think this is happening? Interestingly, sorry, I forget what I even put in my slides sometime. In England, climate change is increasing seed production. So here in New Mexico, it's decreasing seed production because it's dry. But in the cold, foggy England, all this energy is producing more seeds. And you think, oh, great, more seeds. It sounds excellent. It's this idea of predator satiation. Insects are eating more of these seeds. Because there's more seeds all the time, there's more insects, and fewer seeds are actually reaching the ground. Pretty interesting. Shows how it's kind of complex. But so why are piñon crops declining? What does temperature have anything to do with anything? So as I mentioned, seed initiation occurs in the late summer. Here in New Mexico, that's kind of the tail end of the monsoon, right? So usually the monsoon not only brings rain, but cool weather. Nice RH, cools everything off. And so a good monsoon provides that extra boost at the end of the growing season when trees are deciding to grow or to produce sex cells. That monsoon, that cool late summer, will determine whether or not it's going to produce sex cells that year. When it's a bad monsoon, if it's a hot, dry year, no cones. Quite simple. And so this is essentially what this figure is showing here. Again, we're going back in time, and this is showing the correlation between monthly climate, and this is that period of seed cone initiation and seed cone pollination. So we see these two discrete periods of time that seem to be really strongly associated with your final size of your piñon crop. Moreover, climate. So again, we're talking weather. Weather's what happens today. Climate's what happens this year. So sites that are drier, think south aspects, low elevations, poor soils. Those sites will produce fewer crops less frequently. And the wet sites, high elevations, north aspects, drainages, they'll produce more cones more often. So I hope I said that right. Drier, less cones less often. Wetter, more cones more often. Kind of interesting. And so as I mentioned, the monsoon was a really important driver of this. This map is showing, it's not a great coloration, but the blue is the strength of the monsoon here. And so clearly, and here's Silver City down here, Santa Fe, Durango, just to orient ourselves. So we can see the monsoon really tails off right when you get into Colorado, honestly. All of western Colorado is really snow-dominated rather than rain-dominated as we are down here. It's probably too hard to see because I'm very close and I can't even see it, but these letters all match. And so these are groups that all seem to produce cones in synchrony with each other. So all of southern New Mexico can be producing mast crops at the same time, whereas looks like kind of northern New Mexico tends to cluster more with the San Juans in southwest Colorado, and then you have its own kind of western Colorado group over here. So the patterns of climate also determine the patterns of synchrony in mast production. And a big reason we think we're seeing this kind of interesting pattern is, like I said, the importance of snow versus rain. So if you're getting a lot of snow in the winter, you're going to have a good spring almost all the time, right? You're going to have nice wet springs, but traditionally it's a hot, dry, windy spring here. It's not very common to have a super wet spring like we did this year. So in those regions, the monsoon becomes spring temperature is much more important for those areas that don't receive snow, if that makes sense. And alternatively, the summer temperature is much more important for these sites that don't receive the monsoon. So there's these variable patterns of sensitivity. This is going to be a heck of a figure, and I apologize for it. Yeah, you can barely see it. Basically, I said, okay, what does El Nino have to do with any of this? How does El Nino affect masting in Pinyon? And if you can see, there's what's called a dipole. That's where one area is experiencing the opposite conditions of another. So this is temperature. Here's the Black Hills, Montana, Wyoming. It gets hot when there's an El Nino year. It gets hot up north, but it stays nice and cool down here in New Mexico. This figure is showing basically cone production tied to El Nino, this dashed line. It's a pretty tight relationship. And we see that in these blue years, it's these blue sites that are producing cones. And in these brown years, La Nina years, it's these brown sites that are producing cones. So there's this dipole, this seesaw effect that's being pushed and pulled between Colorado and New Mexico. And is largely driven by El Nino, which shapes winter precip largely, winter precipitation in spring. And so just to recap, because that's been a lot, right? So masting is driven by weather during these two key periods, late summer and early spring. Both kind of dryness as well as the monsoon will impact how many cones you produce and how often you produce them. And the El Nino-La Nina cycle pushes and pulls seed production between the northern and southern extent of its range, which is pretty neat. So we're going to talk a little bit about how masting affects plants, animals, and humans. And to do that, we're going to take a quick digression. All right, I have to be totally honest. I practiced this talk up to this point. So from here on, I'm winging it. So bear with me. This is a famous study that was done in Flagstaff. And they basically cut down a bunch of trees and precisely dated the inner core of all the trees. And they found that almost all of them regenerated in a single year. No matter if you're big, small, tall, fat, whatever, almost all the trees showed up in 1919. There's a little bit on either side, but that's honestly probably error. It was probably all trees popped up in 1919. And so what happened? In 1918, there was a mast year, followed by a super wet spring in 1919. This is, you can't really see this, but this is a carpet of ponderosa pine regeneration here from 1914. So this is an ancient photograph, but these recruitment events can be really important, right? So we're thinking about plants putting out seeds. Why are they doing that? To regenerate, right? They're trying to make a new individual, but they're trying to avoid getting eaten by squirrels and birds at the same time, right? So perhaps this is an example of satiation paying off, where this big mast year led to this huge recruitment event, and you don't see any other recruitment events for the next, what is that? That's 1990. So for the next 80 years, no other trees regenerated. So these events can be periodic, episodic, and pretty striking to see. There was a pretty good one in 2015, another El Nino year. There was a big recruitment event in Arizona. They're like, this tall right now. See how they do in 100 years. But yes, this idea of episodic plant regeneration is an important component of many plants' life cycles. A famous example is bamboo, which only flowers once in its entire life and then dies. So I think it's something like 60, 70, 80 years. It'll have a big masting event, and then everything dies. And you'd say, well, that's pretty strange. But that kindling provides perfect fuel for fire. And fire provides the perfect environment for seedling germination. So it produces seeds, it dies, that burns, and the bamboo comes back, and the cycle continues. So these episodic regeneration events are actually pretty common. Pretty common in plants. So it's pretty fun. Again, we've talked about this idea of predator satiation a lot. So these boom and bust cycles of seed production result in boom and bust cycles of animal populations as well. So pretty hard to see, but if you can see these blue bars, these are just theoretical, mast years here. This pinkish line shows sort of animal populations responding positively, kind of right after that. And then there's this other line showing a second boost following this pink boost, if you're staying with me. So seeds are produced, little things eat them, and then big things eat the little things. So these are mast years. They're trophic cascades, trophic systems, primary producers, primary consumers, tertiary consumers. Let's go back to Bio 101. Different food webs, right? I'm trying to think of the right word. That's not trophic. But yeah, food webs. They ripple across food webs pretty amazingly. And so mutualism is this idea when two organisms provide complementary services to one another. And so the classic idea is jays, like Piñon jay or nutcrackers, and conifers. So most conifer seeds are too heavy to fall very far from the tree. Most of them fall, within about 100 meters of the tree. Depends on how tall your tree is and how high the wind's blowing that day. But usually, a tree can spit seeds about 100 meters from its top. But this idea of long distance dispersal, let's think about how the plants were migrating with climate change. It would take millennia for plants to move 100 meters every 100 years. But these long distance dispersal events can be really important in moving those populations along. And so kind of a classic example is the Piñon jay. So these jays will eat, piñon seeds and then fly them, 4, 5, 6 kilometers away, bury them as a little cache for the winter. And it's actually got a pretty good memory. It'll come back and it'll dig up the caches and it'll have food, but it doesn't remember all of its caches. So it's effectively planting seeds. It goes, it grabs the seeds, it buries them in a great spot. And if it forgets it, it turns into a seedling germinate. So it's this mutualism between the Pinyon and the Piñon jay is really cool. Jays will only reproduce in years that there are masting trees. So actually, real bright. I brought this to show to the class. If you look at the ends of these tips, you'll see new cones emerging. And so Piñon jays will only reproduce when they see that happening. So it's going to be, and for the record, what we're looking at are cones that are initiating this year, or initiated last year and just emerged. So those will be mature next year. There are some cones that are coming up this year, but if you just look around, once you see this, you can't stop seeing it. All the trees are producing cones this year. So it's going to be a good year for cones, good year for jays. And thank you very much. Yeah, no, absolutely right. I get so confused talking time. Thank you so much. And so a really interesting adaptation. Most trees point their cones down so that they can catch the wind and the seed can go fly off somewhere. But Piñon point them up so that the jays can see them when they're flying. And they're so freaking good at this, they can pick out a full seed from an unfilled seed from 100 meters away. They can just see and say, that's a good one, that's a bad one. And they leave the bad ones for me. But so unfortunately, it's always a sad story. The Piñon jay is rapidly declining. Populations have probably declined by at least 50% or more since the 1970s. And why is this happening? It's a good question. Is it because of these big die-off events? Is it because of the declining cone production? Is it because there's just fewer trees on the landscape? It's a good question. We have no idea. But it's part of some ongoing research right now between myself and Bandelier. We're initiating Piñon jay surveys. We're coupling them with reproduction surveys. And we hope to understand what jays like and why they like it. where they're living and why they like to live there. And so the last thing we're going to talk about is how it affects humans. So beyond just pollen allergies, which I get terrible allergies, masting can be a harbinger of disease. So these rodent populations are exploding, right? So do the vectors that carry diseases, right? So if a very common example is Lyme's disease, which is a tick-borne disease carried on mice out east. And so we see these really tight relationships between masting, rodents, ticks, Lyme disease in people. And I just randomly pulled a paper, and this was from 21, and it's showing beech trees now predict the risk of Lyme disease. So it's not this very rare occurrence. I believe this is much more common than we expect. I'm not saying COVID happened because of a mast year, but I'm saying it could happen. So I was born in 1992, so I don't remember this. But in 1993, there was a hantavirus outbreak in New Mexico. This is an article from the time, back when it wasn't really sure what was going on. In fact, actually, I wrote this down because this story is so good. So in April of 93, a woman arrived in the emergency room in Gallup with severe shortness of breath. She died almost immediately. Her lungs were full of fluid, twice the normal weight for someone her age. 5 days later, her fiancé was en route to her funeral when he became short of breath. By the time paramedics brought him to the emergency room, he had stopped breathing. So there was this sudden disease that was super killer, killed 50% of all the people it infected. But they were initially stumped, right? When people start dying, they don't say, oh, it's hantavirus. They say, what's going on? So they turned to Navajo elders and they said, do you have any idea what's going on? And there's an oral tradition in the Navajo tradition. I'll just read this to you. Excess of any kind is a form of disharmony. Excess rain and snowfall in the winter of 92 and spring of 93 resulted in an unusually wet year that brought an abundance of piñon and new vegetation. Elders told the federal investigators that Navajo oral tradition mentions 3 times this century when many Navajo people died of sudden, powerful diseases. 1918, mass year, 1918, anybody? 1933, 1993. In each of those years, there was an abundant piñon crop because of the wet winters, and rodent populations were high. So there's something going on here that I think is really interesting. I've seen a lot of papers that talk about this, but I've yet to see the one that fundamentally links it. So I think there's a really interesting link between piñon crops and hantavirus outbreaks. And this gets to kind of the final part of this talk, is how forecasting masting might improve forest management. And so we've walked through this cycle now where weather produces seeds, that produces mice, that produces ticks, and that produces disease. And so if we are better able to know when mast years are going to happen, like what we have here, and I don't need that back, you just put it down when you're done, is if we can know that we're going to see a mast year next year, we can start planning and we can start thinking about these things in advance. So this figure here is just showing kind of a conceptual framework for this, where this dashed line represents what's called the forecast horizon. So that's where your uncertainty is acceptable to the point where you can make a decision, where you're like, I don't know for sure, but I'm pretty sure. So once we have a good idea it's going to be a mast year, we can start thinking about seed collection. So my wife works in wild seed collection. A lot of people are collecting seed for reforestation, restoration. And oftentimes they're just like flying by the seat of their pants, like, we got a crew, let's go out, and I heard it was wet down in Las Cruces, so we're going to go check it out. So if we can be quantitative about this, we can maybe be a lot more targeted with how we're collecting seeds, where we're collecting seeds, how we're spending those resources. Then we can think about wildlife populations. We want to manage mice, we want to manage deer, we want to manage whatever, right? We can begin to think about these populations of animals that could explode a year or two following a mast event. And then, of course, this idea of diseases, and forest regeneration, and all these other applications of masting that I'm so excited about. So I'm developing this plan. It's just this idea of ecological forecasting. It comes from weather forecasting. And it's actually kind of amazing that weather forecasts have really substantially improved our understanding of meteorology over the last 50 years. The lead times for forecasts are substantially better than even they were 20 years ago. So we learn, it's just the fundamental process of science. prediction, validation, refinement. Prediction, validation, refinement. So if we can predict, let's see. If we can predict where there's going to be mast years, if we know these climate conditions, we can say, okay, we have a reasonable degree of certainty. We're going to see a mast year here. We can go out and we can test that. We can go there and we can collect data and we can put that back into a model and predict next year's and see if we're doing well or if all of this is not true. Just kidding. But yeah, so this is something I'm planning on doing. I'm just kind of getting it off the ground right now. Like I said, it needs to be verified. So I'm in the process of enlisting trained observers to go out and look for cones in the fall. And I think, beyond the Pinyon, there's applications for other species, right? We can do this for different trees, maybe for flowering plants, maybe for penstemon, maybe we can forecast other processes like tree mortality, not just tree reproduction, but tree death. And then we got to think about, who would use something like this? Who wants it? Why is this useful? How can we make it useful? And what level of detail would be appropriate, right? Do we want high resolution 30 meter squared predictions of massed probability, or will that cause hordes of people to descend upon this one tree, right? You have to think about, I'm not just trying to keep my data to myself, but you have to think about an appropriate level of data to be distributing to a broad public audience. So these are all questions that I'm working through, and I'm really excited to work through. Okay, cool. So just to wrap up, masting, as I said before, it's the rhythm of the forest. It sets the pace, it sets the tempo, it sets the pulse of both plants and animals and disease populations. These impacts ripple across trophic systems, across multiple years, to these human ecological systems. And managing forests in sync with this rhythm may really improve resource sustainability, resource efficiency, and overall outcomes of restoration projects. And I think forecasts are the tool that are going to take us there. But we need broad support from communities, land managers, pueblos, and anyone who's involved with Pinyon collecting. And so with that, thank you all so much for listening.